of the Minority Leader.
You want to go first? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent for all members to have 5 days to advise and extend their remarks on the subject of my special order hour.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I would yield to the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Cedric Richmond of the great state of Louisiana.
Thank you, Congresswoman Plaskett. Mr. Speaker, the CBC has led the charge in proposing solutions for the underserved and disadvantaged communities throughout this country. In his first remarks as president, Donald Trump claimed to champion this cause in his remarks, which proved to be petty and beneath the office of President of the United States. On day one, in his first official acts in the office, one of his first official acts was to remove from the whitehouse.gov website a page detailing a broad set of civil rights commitments and accomplishments under President Obama. It's fitting that President Trump, as one of his very first actions in office, would take down the public pledge to defend the civil rights of all Americans. This is a continuation of the divisiveness that defined his campaign, where he proposed a Muslim ban, mass deportation, and a nationwide stop-and-frisk program. This is consistent with the president who would nominate Jeff Sessions, a man unanimously opposed by the civil rights community, as Attorney General. President Trump didn't stop with changing the website. It's been reported that the Department of Justice is seeking to delay a hearing meant to focus on the relief required for Texas's discriminatory voter identification law. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit ruled last year that the law had a discriminatory effect and that provisions must be made to allow those who lack the specific ID that the law requires to be able to cast a vote. Every judge who has considered the Texas law found it discriminatory, but it still has been used in elections there. Unfortunately, President Trump has given no indication that he's willing to stand up to protect the voting rights of all Americans. Since getting elected, he has ignored proven instances of intentional voter suppression and chosen instead to spread alternative facts about voter fraud. And as one of his first substantive acts, the Trump administration suspended a mortgage insurance rate cut put in place by the Obama administration to give relief to homeowners. According to the Federal Housing Administration, the cut would have saved the average homeowner $500 this year. This reversal will make it more difficult for middle-class Americans trying to purchase a home and eliminate relief for homeowners struggling to make their mortgage payments. According to the National Association of Realtors, this will prevent 30,000 to 40,000 new home buyers from purchasing homes in 2017. This move will disproportionately affect African American homeowners who are more likely than white homeowners to rely on a FHA mortgage insurance. Mr. Speaker, we know exactly who Donald Trump is and have an inclination of what he intends to do. But what we plan on doing is educating the president about the needs of underserved communities. So I would just take a moment to address a few of his points in his New Deal for the African American community, which is truly a bad deal in terms of economic equality. It's a raw deal in terms of public education, and it's a hollow deal in terms of voting and civil rights. As a caucus, the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, would like to inform him that 39% of African Americans actually live in suburbs, compared to 36% who live in inner cities. The remaining 25% live in small metropolitan areas or rural communities. For more than 45 years, the Congressional Black Caucus has worked to improve conditions for African Americans from all walks of life. Collectively, our members represent 78 million Americans, 17 million of whom are African American. Our districts are rural as well as urban. Some of our members represent majority minority districts. while others do not. Mr. Speaker, tonight you will hear from several members of the Congressional Black Caucus who will point to specific pieces of legislation that we have championed, that we have authored, that would address many of the issues facing inner-city communities, facing poor communities, and facing communities all across this country, no matter the race or makeup of those communities. And what I would like to reiterate and stress is the fact that we don't just talk about a problem, but we offer solutions. And we have sent to you, Mr. President, a letter outlining all of the 10 points in your New Deal with concrete solutions and legislation that we have authored that we think will go further, and it's a more comprehensive way of approaching the problems in those communities. We also sent you another document that details more than your 10 issues, but highlights issues that are faced by American families all across this country and our policy proposals that will solve them. And we would just encourage you to step out of the White House and to listen to people who have done this for a long time and who live in those communities and who have offered viable solutions. So I would just say that we don't need more talk or more rhetoric. What we need is action, and we need action from 1600 Pennsylvania. We need action from the White House, and we would urge you to look at the proposals that we have that offer a better solution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with that, I will yield back.
Thank you so much to the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, my friend and colleague, the Honorable Cedric Richmond, for his leadership in our caucus, as well as his continued fight on the issues impacting Black Americans and other minority communities and underserved American communities in this great nation. I would also like to thank my colleague, the Honorable Mark Veasey of Texas, for joining me in chairing this evening's Special Order Hour, and my many colleagues of the Congressional Black Caucus who are here to speak on this most important issue. Mr. Speaker, we're here tonight as representatives of America's minority communities to respond directly to President Trump's inaugural address and specifically to his New Deal for African Americans. During President Trump's campaign, he promised to address issues confronting African Americans, and he gave a 10-point plan outlining that. We have studiously reviewed the issues outlined in the plan and have concrete suggestions for him in accomplishing those goals. While I acknowledge President Trump's willingness to confront these issues, I find the points in his New Deal do not go far enough in substance to adequately address the needs of African American communities and rely heavily on assumptions that African American communities are primarily in the inner cities. Just as the chairman spoke of earlier this evening, let's not continue with this fallacy and stereotyping of the dynamic diversity of African Americans in this country. African Americans live in the Rust Belt. They live in rural areas across this country, in suburbs, and they live in territories. My home district of the U.S. Virgin Islands has a population of 100,000 American citizens and permanent residents. It is a majority minority, and it too has experienced the same slow recovery as many of the economically dispossessed communities across America. And the issues of the African Americans cannot be solved in just 10 bullet points directed to a small portion of the African American community. Mr. Speaker, we are here this evening in large part to send a message, suggestions, thoughts, ideas, support to President Trump that if he is serious about addressing the issues in disadvantaged communities, it would be wise to tap into the decades of experience held by the members of this caucus. The answers to those 10 points are varied, nuanced, and we have been working on them for decades and are happy to support positive improvements in our underserved communities. For almost a half-century, this caucus has advocated to improve the lives of millions of Americans in both rural and urban communities. African Americans, and all Americans. The 49 members of this caucus who sit in both houses of Congress and the members before us tonight have offered policy solutions for decades that would help not only those African American communities, but in underserved areas nationwide. We will continue to lead by offering solutions to improve the lives of all Americans in search of better opportunities. We are hopeful to give you an idea of some of those this evening. And at this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield to my able colleague, Mark Veasey of Texas, for his remarks on this matter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands that is helping lead tonight's special order hour that, again, is going to highlight how President Trump's inaugural address served as a preview of what the African American community can expect over the next 4 years. This past Friday, thousands of Americans from all over the country traveled to Washington, D.C. To witness the new president and what type of message he was going to deliver. Unfortunately, instead of starting his presidency with a bold new agenda that would benefit all Americans, what we heard was an inaugural address that reminded us that the America he wants to build will leave many of the constituents, that those of us who serve as members of the Congressional Black Caucus, that he will leave those constituents behind. In his speech, President Trump said that a nation exists to serve its citizens, but far too many of its citizens, but for far too many of its citizens, a different reality exists. He also painted another grim picture of mothers and children trapped in poverty in inner cities and rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation. An education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of knowledge, and crimes and gangs and drugs that have stolen the lives of too many and robbed the country of so much of its unrealized potential. And those are problems that need to be addressed. I don't think that anybody will disagree with that. We need to make sure that our children have access to good public schools, good quality education. We need to make sure that as the nature of work changes in this country, that people are ready to get those new jobs. And we must invest. We must make sure that we invest in our communities so they prosper. But yet, very little of what President Trump proposed would actually address the root cause of any of those problems. Yet very little, but not even his New Deal for Black Americans provides real solutions for the problems that he outlined in his inaugural address. Instead, we see the same recycled, broken promises. Since the creation of the Congressional Black Caucus, we've been fighting to uplift our communities. We have bold ideas to help really transform the lives of those individuals that were mentioned, and real ideas that can really get going. And with that, I'm going to yield back to the gentlelady as we get prepared to have other speakers from the Congressional Black Caucus share their remarks.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the remarks that you've given, particularly about the grim view that was given of African Americans during the inauguration that really didn't expound on the great diversity that is here. We have someone from another part of our country who is now going to speak, one of our senior great leaders of the Congressional Black Caucus, former chairwoman of the caucus from California, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who's going to give us her remarks and her thoughts on this topic this evening.
Thank you. Let me first thank you, Congresswoman Plaskett, for yielding, but also for your tireless leadership to protect our progress, but also for your vigilance and hard work on behalf of your district and the territories. And thank you and Congressman Mark Veasey for co-leading our special orders, making sure that the drum is being beat very loudly throughout the country with regard to what is taking place here in Washington, D.C. For more than 45 years, the Congressional Black Caucus has been the conscience of the Congress. Since its founding, we fought for robust legislative action to lift our constituents and the African American community in a way to ensure equal justice under the law so that everyone, including African Americans, will be able to live the American dream. Now, make no mistake about it, we will continue to fight for justice and equality under President Donald Trump. Now, the president's inaugural address, quite frankly, was appalling. In my nearly 20 years in the House, I cannot recall a darker, more pessimistic view of our nation from an incoming president. The president's inaugural address distorted the truth about our communities. He used dog whistles to paint a frightening picture of our neighborhoods and to stoke fear. And let me be clear. America is not the downtrodden, helpless nation President Trump described. Yes, we have much more work to do to ensure equal justice under the law and to address the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and segregation. But this means public investments in housing, education, jobs, not budget cuts and corporate tax breaks that just do the opposite and also dismantles the safety net. Within hours of taking office, the president already began to unravel the progress of the last 8 years. With the stroke of a pen, the president stuck a dagger in the heart of the Affordable Care Act that will take away health care for millions and pull the rug out from under low-income families seeking to buy homes. These destructive policies are an attack on the most vulnerable in our society. It is clear that these executive orders will disproportionately harm communities of color, the African American community, and the poor. Repealing the Affordable Care Act is just really the tip of the iceberg. We've seen the Trump administration, what they're doing. They're planning a full-scale attack on the most marginalized communities in our society. Last year, after continually insulting the African American community, the Trump's New Deal, actually it's really a so-called New Deal for Black America, it really did just add insult to injury. Rather than helping struggling families, this agenda would gut Social Security, repeal the Affordable Care Act, and abolish the safety net. We know that these cuts now will just lead to more poverty. This approach is dead wrong. Instead of stepping on the most vulnerable to benefit special interests, President Trump should follow the CBC's lead by supporting a national strategy to eliminate poverty and extend economic opportunity to all Americans. He can start by supporting our Half in 10 Act, which would reduce poverty in half in 10 years. And if the Trump administration really wants a New Deal to benefit African Americans, they should look to our Assistant Leader Jim Clyburn's 10-20-30 anti-poverty plan, which would direct at least 10% of funds in designated accounts to be spent in communities experiencing persistent poverty, those with a poverty rate of at least 20% over the last 30 years. These are just a few of the proposals that we have to address poverty and lift up our communities. What we won't do is allow President Trump to roll back progress or push more families over the edge into poverty. We should be identifying the root causes of poverty and developing policies that lift Americans up. Instead, President Trump has shown he'd rather line the pockets of billionaires and advance those failed trickle-down economics. In President Trump's New Deal for African Americans, let me just read you very quickly what he said. He said, "We will restore the civil rights of African Americans." This has to do with illegal immigration. "We will restore the civil rights of all African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and all Americans by ending illegal immigration." Our response is the CBC will not buy into the divisive rhetoric that blames immigration for the social and economic problems in African American communities. Our members support comprehensive immigration reform. President Trump will not roll back the clock on our progress or doom another generation to the crippling effects of poverty. Let me be clear, this deal, this 10-point plan, it really is a slap in the face to African Americans everywhere. So as co-chair of the CBC's working group on poverty and the economy, along with Congressman Cleaver, and also as chair of the Democratic Whip's Task Force on Poverty, Income, and Opportunity, we will continue to work to make sure that the vital resources for low-income Americans, for African Americans, and those struggling to make ends meet are there, and we will make sure that the country understands that the Congressional Black Caucus continues to fight for a real deal for the American community, for our entire nation, and that means lifting people out of poverty, creating good-paying jobs, and moving forward on the progress that has been made. Thank you again for your leadership.
And thank you so much, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. I was really very interested in the discussion you had about the work that you've done to alleviate poverty, both in the Democratic Caucus as well as the Congressional Black Caucus, particularly your words about immigration, not allowing immigration to be divisive and used as a means to separate Americans and not being able to realize the American dream. America is big enough to have immigrants under a comprehensive immigration plan that will allow all of us to be able to lift it up. And I want to thank you so much for your leadership on that, and particularly the fight that you have been fighting for so many years when it comes to alleviating poverty in the United States. At this time, I'd like to yield time to the great Congresswoman from not only the state of Michigan, but more specifically from the great state of Detroit, where she has been a strong voice for the people of Detroit, a strong voice for even the surrounding areas. Your work on Flint, Michigan, and its water crisis, and other areas, people who are in the inner city that need support in so many areas. Thank you so much for that, and I yield time to you to speak on those issues that are the topic for today.
I want to thank the Congresswoman, my colleague, and thank you for your leadership. Mr. Speaker, the Congressional Black Caucus, the conscience of Congress, stands strong to promote unity and fight against the divisive rhetoric. Trump's inaugural speech included a lot of pledges and promises. Pledges, and I quote, allegiance to all Americans. Promises to the American people saying, and I quote, I will never let you down. He even quoted the Bible, how good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. But pledges and promises fall flat when tweets, speeches, and now actions are followed by reckless executive orders, thoughtless nominations for our nation leaders, and attacks on the American healthcare system. The American people were let down when our President Trump nominated unqualified and out-of-touch candidates such as Senator Jeff Sessions, Betsy DeVos, and Tom Price. How can you pledge allegiance to all Americans while threatening to leave so many without options and access to health care coverage? This is not unity, it's hypocrisy. We need to focus on facts and not quotes or alternative facts. I have a question. Do we have a replacement for the Affordable Health Care Act? Is it a fact a repeal without a replacement will leave over 30 million people uninsured? Yes, that is a fact. Is it a fact that Betsy DeVos, if confirmed, will be the first Secretary of Education without any prior experience in public schools, including early childhood education and higher education? Is it a fact that Jeff Sessions has been nominated as the Attorney General but was denied federal judgeship over accusations of racism? I support efforts that will bring more jobs to the American people. I fully support efforts to improve our country's transportation and infrastructure. But only time will tell if our new President Trump will follow through with the promises he's made to the American people on Inauguration Day. Only time will tell if he will continue to act, speak, and tweet in a manner that builds walls and not bridges. Mr. Speaker, the Congressional Black Caucus intends to be a voice to create bridges and work toward real solutions to the real challenges that face African Americans, minorities, and the unheard and the disenfranchised. We will be watching and we will be listening, and we will continue to fight for equality, liberty, and justice for all. And I yield back to...
Thank you so much, and thank you for those words and for your thoughts on these issues. And at this time, I would love to have the Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who has been a stalwart for social justice, a stalwart on the Judiciary Committee, and is going to speak on the issue that is here before us this evening, the CBC Special Order Hour, a response to President Trump's inaugural address and his New Deal for African Americans. Thank you so much.
Let me thank the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands and the gentleman from Texas for their service to the nation and for leading the Congressional Black Caucus special orders. It's always important for the voices of the Congressional Black Caucus and the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Richmond of Louisiana, to be heard. And both Ms. Plaskett and Mr. Veasey have accepted the challenge and the call, and I want to tell them or express to them my greatest appreciation for the leadership that they are showing. I want to start my remarks again with, it may be hometown pride, but I like the headline of the Houston Chronicle that says, "Powerful Together." The numbers have not yet been fully calculated, but we know upwards of 1 million and maybe over 1 million persons around the nation, and then they added individuals from foreign countries far and wide. And I would take by this title that represents, Mr. Speaker, the peaceful protests. I want to say that again. In fact, I might want to say it 2 times. Peaceful protests, nonviolent protests that occurred on a Saturday, expressing the view of what America is really about. And I say that to my colleagues. They're about what the Congressional Black Caucus is about. And I believe our chairman made the point that we come from very diverse districts representing people of many racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds, and as well economic backgrounds, that we are the voice of reason and the conscience of this Congress. We fight against poverty, but we have PhDs and lawyers, judges, we have business persons, and they by and large, Mr. Speaker, are charitable individuals who believe in social justice. And that is why we come with a sense of privilege, if you will, to be able to speak about what America truly is. Yesterday at the Community of Faith, under the leadership of Bishop James Dixon, I gathered for a prayer for the nation. Mr. Speaker, I did not dissect it. I did not eliminate the White House. I did not point out members of Congress, call them by name. I said a prayer for the nation. And that included the White House. It included individuals in the Congress and the Senate. And we had international representation, the Consul General of Pakistan. We had imams. We had individuals who worship on Saturday, Sabbath. We had people who spoke Spanish, people who spoke obviously English. And we gathered to pray for the nation. And that is what I think is represented in the message or the title of the New Deal for Black America. It needs prayer because it is not reflective, although well-intentioned. I'm not sure who may have advised the administration, but it does not speak to the wideness of diversity of the African American population, African American communities in this nation. And so I want to speak very briefly on questions of health care and justice. And I would like to say that in the safe communities of which the administration or the president has offered his New Deal, he says, we will make our communities safe again. Every poor African-American child must be able to walk down the street in peace. Safety is a civil right. We will invest in training and funding both local and federal law enforcement operations to remove the gang members, drug dealers, and criminal cartels from our neighborhoods. The reduction of crime is not merely a goal, but a necessity. In that, there is no mention of ending gun violence or looking at sensible gun safety regulations or laws, of which we've asked. I introduced Gun Violence Reduction Resources Act, which really answered Republicans' cry for enforcing the law, to add to the ATF to enforce the penalties against those who use guns wrong. In particular, the perpetrator in Mother Emanuel should not have been able to get the gun, but he was, because the gun dealer was so easy and quick to sell it, even though he had not gotten an affirmation by ATF. That's the one, and I would argue that it's because they did not have enough personnel. He also seems to categorize that every poor child has to walk down the streets. We want every child to walk down, and as I said, our community is very diverse. He then says equal justice under the law. We will apply the law fairly, equally, and without prejudice. There will be only one set of rules and not a two-tiered justice. Equal justice also means the same rules for Wall Street. So I quickly want to offer these points before I yield the floor. Number one, we're not all impoverished, but I join my colleagues in ending poverty. African Americans want the same thing, as Barbara Jordan said when asked, what do your people want? It's the same thing that all America wants. And yes, we do want opportunities, but we do have to be more forceful for issues that are relevant. We have seen nothing in Mr. Trump's statement of a New Deal for America to deal with sentencing reduction and ending mandatory minimums. We see nothing about working with police departments that have found themselves, who've fallen upon bad times and have a plague of bad actors, even though we respect and honor police. And so the Law Enforcement Integrity Act that John Conyers and myself introduced has to do with correcting the issue of training and the improper interaction of police and community. And I would offer to say that the nominee for the Attorney General is completely opposed to addressing any questions of bad behavior on behalf of bad actors and bad officers. And in fact, he opposed consent decrees like the one in Ferguson and Baltimore that were only positive, welcomed by the police departments to help them do a better job at policing the community. Prison reform to change the matrix of prison, gun violence prevention that I've already mentioned, and health care access that are truly crucial to all of us. Let me also indicate a changing of the matrix of juvenile justice. We want to reauthorize the Juvenile Black Grant Accountability Act, but more importantly, we want to change how we're dealing with juveniles. We want to change from the idea of them being, if you will, punished versus incentives. Finally, let me offer to say that 2 senators in the other body have offered a new matrix on health care. I understand there are some proposals here. I would say that we see that we can't have unity. We don't have any replacement. And what is being offered by the senators is health savings account, which we know are not realistic. And so I'd offer to the President that there are many ways of looking at serving all of America, including African Americans. It is not listening to your own voice. It is helping us change the matrix for juveniles, change the matrix for those who are incarcerated, mandatory minimums, the way police and community work, at the same time respecting them, but more importantly, it's listening and working with members who have real life experiences in some of the issues that will make this country continue to be the greatest country in the world. I yield back, and I thank the gentlelady for her courtesies.
Thank you so much to the Congresswoman from Texas, and I want to thank you for all of the work that you've been doing, not just in terms of incarceration reform, but pointing out to us the safety of children, that the safety of children also includes gun violence in their communities. That is so very important. And of course, your real work, the real tireless work that you have in terms of juvenile justice. Mr. Speaker, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee has been at the forefront of changing the dynamic in how we see juveniles and the things that lead them into incarceration or leads them into problems with the law and the solutions that are on the table. And this is what we're speaking about this evening, giving real solutions and concrete legislation that has already been drafted and worked on by members of the Congressional Black Caucus that President Trump can use in carrying out the 10-point plan that he has. At this time, I'd like to yield time to the Congresswoman from Wisconsin, Gwen Moore, who also would like to speak on this topic. and who has been doing tireless work in her district of Wisconsin, but throughout the United States for communities, for children, for working mothers, for women who are attempting to move ahead to receive a part of the economic justice, who has really been concerned about so many of the things that we are talking about this evening. And I yield time to her to speak to us this evening.
Well, I do want to thank the delegate, the Congresswoman from the Virgin Islands, and her counterpart, Mr. Veasey from Texas, for really supporting this Congressional Black Caucus Hour so that we can discuss the pledges and proposals that President Trump has made to as the New Deal within the black community. I guess, Madam, Mr. Speaker and Madam Chairwoman of this, I guess I would like to engage in a kind of a colloquy with my good friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, who has been a state appropriator before he joined this body for some 25 years. I hate to date him, but he's been a member of the prestigious Appropriations Committee, and so therefore he was tasked with taking federal funds and making those appropriations and those decisions at the state level. And so I wanted him to help evaluate some of the proposals that now President Trump has made regarding his New Deal for Black America. One of the proposals that President Trump has made is to allow the conversion of funds for poverty programs to be converted from those programs into micro loans that he would then provide to the poor. I'm feeling a little confused about and perplexed as to how this would work. And I fear that this is part of kind of the doublespeak or alternative facts about the roots of and the solutions to poverty. I am wondering, as you know, you now serve on the Small Business Committee here in the House, and you've been an appropriator. I am wondering if, number one, if converting funds from, say, the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families Act, which is comprised of mostly poor women and children, or Social Security disability insurance, which is set aside for those folks with significant disabilities, or perhaps SNAP and food stamps, those people who are temporarily out of the workforce, waiting to go back, find another job, but need to sort of eat that month. I'm wondering how, in your experience, that converting programs set aside for poor people and providing how would a poor person use a microloan? And I have two questions. I want you to sort of respond to what poor people would do. Presumably, they would create their own jobs with these microloans. How big, perhaps, these microloans would have to be in order for them to establish their own businesses so that they'd be off welfare. And, in fact, on any given day, there are 3 million children who live in extreme poverty off of less than $3 a day. So I guess I would wonder how converting those funds what those children who are not capable and eligible to work would do with such a proposal. And I would yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I think that the points that you are raising are very legitimate in terms of the experience that I've had. And the experience that I've had is always the question is there enough availability of capital in any startup of any particular business? The experience has shown that this idea of microloans hasn't been sustainable or sufficient in terms of what it would mean. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, I think that this is like kind of a pig in a poke, giving people some sense, but really it doesn't give them a sustainable sense of how will you have the necessary long-term investment that is necessary. So I think that this is like smoke and mirrors.
Right.
And you're correct in what you're saying in terms of this is not something that will give them a sustainable effort.
Well, and I thank you for that, because I thought maybe it was just me who thought that. And here we are. We live in a country with the largest economy, with arguably the strongest, greatest technological economy. And I wonder who are on welfare, he says he wants to get them off welfare, would they sell fruit on the street? How would that work in Detroit or Milwaukee? We're not talking about women who live in countries where microloans may work very well in those limited economies. I am also wondering how those people who are structurally unemployed would benefit from these microloans. What this does, Madam Chairperson of this initiative, is that what this really is saying is that this is really perpetuating the persistent myth of people who are poor as the shiftless, lazy welfare queens are poverty pimps, and that the solution is to take away the safety net and force them to do some kind of work, whether that work is sustainable enough for them. And so I would say, as a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, that we ought to have welfare reform that really honors our commitment as Americans to make sure that we provide some kind of safety net for the majority of the poor who are in fact children. There are in fact people who are not capable or should not be responsible for providing for themselves through our very sophisticated economy. I would say, Mr. Speaker, that if we really want to help get people off welfare, we should not start the debate with taking away reproductive freedom from women. One of the major reasons that women fall into poverty is the lack of access to birth control, health care that would enable them to plan their families, plan their pregnancies, and to say that you're going to help people get off welfare and then snatch away funds from Planned Parenthood or their ability to control their reproduction is a non-starter in truly helping the truly poor. I think that President Trump's quest to help those who are truly poor will only come if the president and his team will actually listen to the voices of the poor, actually listen to solutions that have been tried and tested, like providing educational opportunity and upward mobility to poor people, by respecting women's reproductive rights to choose, by really creating a sense of Congress that any goal of welfare reform ought to be to protect children, that any welfare reform ought to make sure that women are free from domestic violence, sex trafficking, and human trafficking, and that they be protected, and that during these periods they not be cut off from public support. And so with that, I would yield back my time.
Thank you.
To you, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to the American people.
Thank you.
Thank you. My colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, did you have additional thoughts on this after having that colloquy with Ms. Moore?
Yes, and I thank you for this opportunity to offer some comments and the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus is taking this lead. I applaud our leadership, Chairman Richmond. Tonight, I join with my colleagues this evening to speak to the plan of our new president has penciled the New Deal for African Americans. This plan, unfortunately, does not meet the needs of our communities and focus on the same assumptions that have not worked for our communities over the years. In his inaugural address, President Trump stated the establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrate in our nation's capital, there was little celebration for struggling families across our land. That was stated by President Trump. Well, while individuals were celebrating last week, actions was taken for people all over our nation to lose their care coverage. And the Federal Housing Administration mortgage insurance rate was cut an hour after President Trump took office, which would have reduced insurance premiums for borrowers for each year. This does not help the men and women and children of our great nation. In the New Deal for Black America, President Trump asserts that there will be tax reform to create jobs and lift our people and communities. Just in my community alone, Mr. Speaker, at Temple University Hospital, which has 8,000 jobs, there are jobs that will be lost due to the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which President Trump signed an executive order to dismantle the day he was sworn in as our president. This is counter to any notion of job creation. And as our chairman so elegantly stated in the letter expressing the views of the caucus on January the 19th, the new administration should target investment to those communities that need it the most and support programs that support small and medium-sized businesses and address the access to capital crisis in the African-American entrepreneurship community. In President Trump's inaugural address, he called for a new national pride which will stir our souls, lift our sights, and heal our divisions. I assert that we already have a national pride. It is the pride that those in our communities feel when there is unity, when they understand that the individuals here in Congress are fighting for them. It is the pride that communities feel when they understand that the groups such as the Congressional Black Caucus zealously represents and advocate to improve the lives over the course of the existence, those in rural and urban communities. An additional point in the New Deal for Black America asserts that financial reform to expand credits to support new job creation and specifically called out the Dodd-Frank reform set forth and protected through the leadership of our ranking member, Waters. Those financial reforms and protections are absolutely essential to protect our community. With the racial wealth gap reaching an unfortunate and historical level, with white households maintaining 13 times the wealth of African American households, we must work to ensure the protection of Dodd-Frank in place. Additionally, as Representative Chairman Richards shared, programs such as Small Business Administration, which provides capital and assistance to minority-owned businesses, must be bolstered. I've spoken directly with my constituents about the need for access to capital. Thus, my statement is not hypocritical or speculative in nature. There's an actual need in our communities so that our small businesses can grow and flourish. Our new president asserts we are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the American people. I assert that the American people have always had the power. I see this power as I walk through my district, as through communities. As I walk through Ogons Avenue and West Oak Lane, part of my district, down Girard Avenue in North Philadelphia, Lancaster Avenue on Main Line, and Baltimore Avenue in West Philadelphia. The faces in my community let me know that the power has always belonged to the people. It is now all up to us to do what is in the best interest of our communities, to work collectively and address the issues that plague our community. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much to my colleague, Dwight Evans of Pennsylvania. I know that you are new to this Congress, but you are so far, have worked for so many years on the issues that we're talking about today, and I look forward to our continued collaboration in supporting so many communities throughout our country. At this time, I would yield to my colleague from Ohio, Joyce Beatty, who has been a stalwart voice in so many of the issues that the Congressional Black Caucus have brought here this evening, and is here, Mr. Speaker, to share some of her thoughts on the things that have been spoken about earlier today.
Thank you so much to my colleague, Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett, for leading tonight's special order hour, joined by her co-chair, Congressman Mark Veasey, and also my classmate. Let me say to our chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Congressman Cedric Richmond for bringing this special order hour here tonight. So much has been said already, but let me say how honored I am to join my colleagues as we address and talk about the response to President Trump's inaugural address and his New Deal for African Americans. Like so many of my colleagues tonight, Mr. Speaker, and countless of Americans who are watching at home tonight, I remain deeply concerned and troubled about several of the statements that Mr. Trump made, and also about the stances of Mr. Trump's cabinet members. Comments about minorities and women and immigrants, and of course, comments about our own colleague, Congressman John Lewis. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker and Congresswoman Plaskett, in Trump's inaugural address, he did nothing to ease those concerns or to unite us. On the contrary, all I heard on Friday was another campaign speech and more of the same divisive rhetoric and recycled ideas from his campaign trail. Ideas like the New Deal for Black America that he mentioned on the campaign trail, the proposal that you've heard a lot about tonight that embraces the same trickle-down economic assumptions that didn't work for African Americans in the past and certainly won't work today. Mr. Speaker, during his campaign speech, Trump talked about gangs roaming the streets and how African American communities are being decimated by crime. He went so far as to say, overwhelmingly, the majority of black people living in inner cities in the United States are, quote, living in hell. End of quote. Well, Mr. Speaker, I want President Trump to know that I am black. I grew up in the United States inner cities, but I didn't live in hell. And here I stand now, educated in the public schools, attended a historically black university and college, and I'm a member of the United States Congress. Mr. Trump said that we are one nation and that their pains are our pains and that their dreams are our dreams and their successes are our successes. And he was referencing, quote unquote, the mothers and children strapped in poverty in inner cities. He was referencing rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation, an educational system flush with cash, but leave our young students deprived of knowledge. Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to see his plans for public education. I want to see his plans for inner city students. I want to see his plans flush with all that cash that he talked about going into our public schools. I want us to unite to help eradicate the cycle of poverty and eliminate the too often traveled pipeline from unperforming schools to overcrowded prisons. I want to see Mr. Trump's plan on criminal justice reform. I want a fair attorney general, vetted and confirmed because they will stand up every single day for equal rights for all Americans, for freedom of speech, for freedom to vote, and much more. Not an attorney general who lacks the ability to represent disenfranchised groups, not someone who fails to champion the least of us. I've not seen those things in nominee sessions. And lastly, I want cabinet members who will be champions for our seniors. People like my 92-year-old mother. I want cabinet members who will stand up for minorities and minority businesses. See, we need greater assistance in minority businesses and funds for minority business. I want cabinet members who will build on and strengthen our health care system. Yes, to make it greater, not take away health care to 30 million people. And let me just say, I want a plan for workforce development programs, for re-entry training programs for those laid-off factory workers. I want to see plans for mothers and families, because we certainly know when women succeed, America succeeds. So yes, Mr. Speaker, I dare ask that women get equal pay for equal work. I don't want recycled, failed policies that will do nothing to heal our communities. I am proud to be a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. We are the conscience of the Congress. So let me end with saying there's so many programs. We have a task force on poverty led by Congresswoman Barbara Lee. I won't repeat the program that Assistant Democratic Leader Clyburn has already introduced, the 10-20-30 plan. Let me again thank my colleagues for bringing your powerful voice to this floor. And let me say, Mr. Speaker, it is incumbent upon all of us to join the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the entire House Democratic Caucus, and all Americans of every color to stand up to President Trump and to continue to let him know, as our preamble of the Constitution says, to form a more perfect union for all Americans. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. This time, I would like to yield 1 minute to the Congresswoman from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
I thank you. I'll take a moment. I was struck by some information that I just received, Congressman Veasey and Congresswoman Plaskett. This is a summary of the New Deal for African Americans, New Deal for Black America, excuse me, Mr. Speaker. Nowhere in the New Deal for Black America is a commitment to protecting voting rights, which really is one of the Achilles heel of the nominee for the Attorney General, is he does not have a history of protecting voting rights. And particularly I want to acknowledge President George W. Bush, because I worked, or the Congress, both House and Senate, worked extensively with him in the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, including Section 5, which is preclearance. Lo and behold, the Shelby case imploded Section 5. We no longer have it, and a potpourri, a flourishing, a garden of weeds voter ID laws, one where my colleague, Mr. Veasey, was a plaintiff, was promoted. So the last point that I want to make is, in addition to not having anything on voting rights, we just had breaking news that the White House has indicated that the president would have had the popular vote if he had not had happened to him 3 to 5 million illegal votes cast. This is being reported, and likewise what is being reported is there is absolutely no evidence that there were 3 to 5 million illegal votes cast in the 2016 election. I think we need to have a focus on voting rights and the protection of those who vote. I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank all the members tonight that have participated. And we are about to run short on our time here, but there are just so many other areas that need to be addressed, and the Congressional Black Caucus is going to continue those. When we talk about safe communities, when we start talking about great education and some of the issues that we see with the nominee for Secretary of Education that threatens to really cripple and hurt our public schools, equal justice for all, how we're going to work with the Justice Department to try to foster some of the good initiatives that President Obama put forward in dealing with community policing. All of those things, Mr. Speaker, and members of the CBC.
Education and workforce development.
And absolutely,
additional
education
ones.
and workforce development with our changing workforce, STEAM jobs and STEM jobs.
So at this time, Mr. Speaker, we want to thank you for the time to address the House during this special order hour, and we yield back the remainder of our time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives, Sir, this letter is to inform you that I have sent a letter to Kansas Governor Sam Brownback informing him that I am resigning my position as the United States Representative for the 4th Congressional District of Kansas, effective upon my confirmation as Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. In November, I was nominated by then President-elect Donald Trump to serve as Director of the Central Intelligence Agency and have now been confirmed to have the privilege to serve in that role. I am truly honored that President Trump has given me the opportunity to lead an amazing organization filled with men and women who put their lives on the line for the safety and security of every American. I want to thank you for all you have done to make the House of Representatives live up to its constitutional duty to represent all Americans. Thank you, too, for your personal assistance in working with me on the issues that impact all Americans, but especially those who I have had the privilege to represent from South Central Kansas. There is much work to do legislatively. I will miss working to be part of this historic opportunity now laid before us. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you as we strive to keep America safe. My commitment to keeping you and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence fully informed on important intelligence matters is sincere and continuing. Signed sincerely, Mike Pompeo, Member of Congress.
Under Clause 5D of Rule 20, the Chair announces to the House that in light of the resignation of the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, the whole number of the House is 434. The Chair announces the Speaker's appointment pursuant to Clause 11 of Rule 10, Clause 11 of Rule 1, and the order of the House of January 3, 2017, of the following member of the House to the Permanent Select Intelligence Committee on Intelligence.
Mr. Hurd of Texas.
For what purpose does the gentleman lady of Virgin Islands rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.